Now we're going to look at what defines profit maximization for the monopolist. So just like our perfectly competitive firm, the monopolist is still assumed to profit maximize. That's their goal. They want to have the highest returns that they can. But like we discussed in the previous video, unlike a perfectly competitive firm, a monopolist output decisions will impact the price, right? This is why we get that marginal revenue um, no longer equals the price, right? It falls faster than that price. So our monopolists are going to have to respond to that fact. What it means is that we're still going to see them produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That profit maximizing output decision is the same. The difference is the price that they're going to charge. So for them, they're going to add some markup above marginal costs. And so what we'll see is they'll produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, because if they produce less than that, right, they're leaving some gains on the table that they could otherwise capture by increasing their output. And if they produce at a point higher than that, right, now they're taking on additional losses. If they, in the case of our graph pictured on the slide, if they produce at 90, right, for those additional 10 units beyond 80 that they're producing, they are earning less than they pay to make those iPads in this case. And at a certain point, marginal revenue will become negative. Okay, so that profit maximizing point for the monopolist is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And that's going to be true for all of our market models, right? Perfect competition, monopoly, oligopoly, monopolistic competition, all of them will produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That marginal thinking doesn't change. What does change is the price that they charge. So because the monopolist can set their price, they're going to add some markup above marginal cost to that price. So in this case of our graph here, the firms are going to produce 80 million iPads because that's what equates their marginal revenue and marginal cost. And they're going to charge $600 for the iPads, even though they can produce them at $200. All right. So that markup is going to be above marginal cost, but it's not going to be unlimited, right? It's constrained by the demand curve. They can't price any higher than consumers are willing to pay. So what that means is that our distribution of surplus, consumer, producer, and deadweight loss is going to look different for a monopolist than it does for the perfectly competitive firm, right? So for the perfectly competitive firm, they would produce at this point C, where marginal cost equals their price, right? Remember, demand we can define in terms of price if we find that inverse equation. So our perfectly competitive firm produces where price equals marginal costs. And in this graph, as we see it here, they're producing twice what our monopolist would produce. Monopolist is producing where marginal revenue equals marginal cost for them, right? We can draw on that marginal revenue curve and then adding some markup over the price. So they produce half as much as that perfectly competitive firm, which is a key result of this model. They're output restrictors. And they also price above marginal cost. So in this case, the monopolist price is $400 above the price that the perfectly competitive firm would set. What this means in terms of surplus is we have firstly some deadweight loss, right? In this graph, we're using the perfectly competitive market model as our counterfactual, as our comparative point. It's defining for us what we think the market, quote unquote, should look like. Because the monopolist restricts output, we have half as much available to consumers, and so half as many trades, and so there is some deadweight loss by definition. We're going to see some consumer surplus, right? But it's going to be much less than under perfect competition. Consumer surplus is this area A. It's the area below that demand curve and above the price that consumers pay, which under the monopoly market is $600. In comparison, if this market were to be perfectly competitive, consumers would take this whole triangle ABC, right? Because the price would be $200 in that case. And so that area below the demand curve and above the price line is that full triangle, right, of trade, and producer surplus would be zero. Because our firm is a monopolist, however, they are able to impact their price. They've marked up to $600, which means they have some difference between their marginal cost of production and the price that they receive. And so there's this positive producer surplus of area B. Okay, so under monopoly, firms earn an individual firm earns producer surplus, whereas in the perfectly competitive market, a single firm is not earning any producer surplus. What we're going to see is that the markup that a monopoly can impose on their good is going to depend on the price, right? So we've already emphasized that the monopoly can not charge whatever they want. They're constrained by the demand curve. And so what that means is that if the demand curve is more inelastic, right, it's steeper, that they are going to be able to have a higher markup, right, than when it is more elastic, right? At that point, their markup is much lower, right? Much less. And so even in our monopoly models, demand is going to be that main driver of price. This is where we get the learner index. You don't need to learn this in detail, but it can be helpful for really understanding why our demand curve is important. And you're going to see in our index as it's written out, markup is going to depend primarily on the elasticity of the demand curve. It's given by that difference between price and marginal cost over our price. And so it's just a percentage of the firm's price that's greater than its cost, and that is giving us our 1 over the elasticity of demand, price elasticity of demand equation. Okay, it's just the inverse of that. And so we can see that that markup is inherently dependent on the elasticity of the demand curve. And so what that means in more layman's terms is that the more sensitive consumers are to the price change, meaning the more elastic the demand curve is, the less the firm can add to that price, the less of a markup the firm is able to impose. So we'll stop here and then go into some examples of solving for the price and output under monopoly, as well as the distribution of surplus under monopoly compared to perfect competition.